Started. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. This event is called Un-Author-Ized, Literature, AI, and Creativity. It is a part of Humanities Washington's Think and Drink program, and the Think and Drink program really brings panels of experts to local breweries, local wineries, and to your living room in instances like tonight to have the opportunity to discuss hot button topics in the humanities. So if there's something we're all talking about and you say, man, I really wish I could hear from an expert in AI or from an author of what they think about AI, this is your opportunity. So thank you all for spending your Monday night with us. We are really grateful. My name is Sarah Faulkner. I work for Humanities Washington, which is a nonprofit here in Washington State. And our mission is to open minds, bridge divides by creating new spaces for people to explore different perspectives. We're all about offering creative thinking opportunities, and beyond that, chances to connect with each other. We've got panelists from around the state. I know you all are watching from all around the state, so we're really glad to be able to connect tonight. We offer a variety of public humanities programs here at Humanities Washington. You may be familiar with our Speakers Bureau program, Primetime Family Reading. We offer a great variety of programs that are all free and open to anyone in the state. And we are in the midst of our year-end giving campaign. If you enjoy this event tonight, which we are very happy to provide free of charge, please consider making a donation to help keep these programs free and accessible to all. And I'm going to go ahead and add our link to our donation site right here in the chat. So hopefully everybody will be able to see this. And on that website as well, humanities.org, you're able to find a variety of information about our programs, all the various things that we are offering. We do have a couple more events in 2023 alone and a wide calendar in 2024. I do want to acknowledge that tonight I'm joining you from Seattle, and I am joining you from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people. And I encourage you, wherever you're joining us from Washington tonight, to reflect on the lands that you inhabit and to acknowledge the ancestral and traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples. So thank you for that. And finally, some housekeeping. Before we begin, this is a recorded event. We will make this available on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends and family who weren't able to attend. We do also offer closed captioning. So if you are interested in captions for this event, you can click on the little, depending on how your Zoom screen is configured, it'll either be the CC button or under More, you'll see something that says Captions. You'll be able to set that to whatever size you wish, whatever language you wish, but we want to make sure this event is as accessible as possible. My final housekeeping before I introduce our fabulous panelists is this is a webinar. So while we're not all together in a big cozy room, you do have the opportunity to interact with our panelists by submitting a question. And you can do that at any point during the webinar. We are going to have our four panelists chat for the first 40 minutes, then we'll move to a formal Q&A. So don't worry if you submit a question and it's not answered right away. We'll have a full Q&A section around 7:45, 7:50, depending on how chatty we are, how much our green tea kicks in. So I think that's the end of my housekeeping. I'm checking my to-do list. Q&A. We've got everything ready to go. So I'm very excited to introduce our four panelists for tonight. Our moderator with us is Tara Campbell, an award-winning writer, teacher, and Cambilio Fellow and fiction co-editor at Barrel House. She graduated from American University's MFA program in creative writing, and she teaches flash fiction, speculative fiction at a variety of institutions, including Hugo House here in Seattle, National Gallery of Art, the Writers Center, and many more. She's the author of a novel, 2 hybrid collections of poetry and prose, and 2 short story collections. And her 6th book, City of Dancing Gargoyles, is forthcoming, Santa Fe Writers Project, in less than a year. Is that right, Tara? Fall 2024? Congratulations. She's originally from Anchorage, Alaska, and has also lived Washington, D.C., Oregon, Ohio, New York, Germany, and Austria. So Tara, thank you so much for joining us to share not only your expertise as a moderator of the conversation, but also how it's feeling for you as an author in this moment, particularly of speculative fiction, right? Imagining what can the future be. So we're so excited to have you. She's joined by another author hailing from Spokane tonight, Sharma Shields. We are so happy to have you. Sharma is the author of a short story collection, Favorite Monster, and 2 novels, The Sasquatch Hunter's Almanac, which was the winner of the Washington State Book Award in fiction, and The Cassandra, which is a recipient of a Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award and is on my bookshelf, which is just out of sight. Sharma is the current writing education specialist for Spokane Public Library, and she and her 14-year-old son recently ditched work and middle school to attend a Linda Linda's concert in Seattle. So very glad to hear that you are not above a bit of fun, Sharma. Thank you so much for being here. And similar to thinking through questions of authorship, questions of education, right? How are we going to be teaching, working with AI in the future? So thank you. We have two more panelists with us tonight. Next is Dr. Ryan Calo, who is the Lane Powell and D. Wayne Gittinger Professor of Law at the University of Washington, where he also holds appointments in the Information, School, and Computer Science. He's the founding co-director of the interdisciplinary UW Tech Policy Lab and of the UW Center for an Informed Public. When he's not writing about robotics and artificial intelligence, he enjoys poetry and ping pong. So thank you so much, Ryan, for being here, sharing your legal expertise. Really appreciate it. And last but not least, we have Dr. Chirag Shah, professor at the University of Washington as well. He is also a founding co-director of the Center on Responsible AI called RAISE, R-A-I-S-E. His research involves AI-driven search and recommender systems. He loves hiking, biking, taking mindful walks around Lake Washington and the Sammamish River. And in his life before becoming a professor, he was a competitive ballroom dancer and teacher, which is very good to know. And we're really looking forward to hearing your perspective on AI in general, but in particular, as we've said in previous conversations, what is its capacity? What can it do? What can it not do? So again, thank you, the four of you, for being here and sharing your time with everyone across the state. We have over 200 people really excited to hear what you have to say. And with that, I'm going to turn my camera off, but I'll come back to say goodnight to you all, and I'll pass the microphone to Tara. Feel free to take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah and Tom behind the scenes, and thank you to everyone who is joining us here tonight. We're kind of speaking out into a void, but we're so glad to see that little number of participants there at the bottom of our screens. As Sarah mentioned, we are going to be talking about AI, and specifically within the field of creative writing and literature. And it's a huge field. So I thought for our discussion tonight, we could start with some definitions and parameters for our discussion. So we're going to be talking about the intersection between literature and AI. So how is AI being built, used, and misused in this context, and what it means for the future, of creativity? And so we're going to be talking probably a lot about ChatGPT, which is the best known example. It's a product of OpenAI. And this, as you may know, allows users to enter prompts like subject matter, characters, even an author's name, to generate a new story or novel that may or may not be using a specific author's voice or intellectual property. So it is a contentious topic. Some people see it as a powerful creative tool, and others call it outright theft. In fact, we'll probably be talking about the lawsuit that the Authors Guild filed, a class action lawsuit in September of this year, with a total of 17 authors, including all sorts of big names I won't list off at the moment. There's also a similar suit filed in the same month, in September of this year, against Meta, aka Facebook. So we're going to be talking about what's technically possible, what's legally permissible, what's ethically defensible, and what is artistically viable within this realm. So to get us started, I was wondering if we could start with how these programs are created, what goes into them, and how do developers get their content? So can I ask one of my panelists to sort of give us a little précis into what is this in the first place that we'll be talking about?
I'm happy to go first.
Thank you.
These are and focusing on the text aspect of it, because there's also the image aspect of it, right? So if you're looking at this novel writing, poetry writing, and things. So these are functions of what's called large language models, or LLMs, LLMs are trained on a large amount of text, and what they're really trying to do at the simplest level is look at the association of tokens. A token could be a word, sentence, all kinds of things. And so if you feed enough data to this, it starts learning essentially the prediction. It can actually start doing predictions. So given this, what follows next and what follows next and so on. And it's this ability that allows it to generate things, sentences, paragraphs, pages, right? Now, this is where it gets a little murky. Is this really creativity? Is this really something that we call, when authors or artists, write or create things? Is this a similar process that they are going through, that they have developed a style, they've kind of learn some things, whether they have developed themselves or from others, and that's what they're using to create their next word, next page? Is this what these LLMs are doing? And I think this is where, again, we can argue that these artificial systems don't really have that ability, and yet they're able to produce these things, right? So what we're looking at is what's called a stochastic production, which means over billions and billions of tokens, it has learned what are the most possible next tokens, and it's using a probabilistic algorithm to then come up with things. So when this happens, it does look like it's really talking to us or writing for us. But I'll leave you with that, because I think then the rest of it gets into what does it really mean?
Right. Would anyone like to add anything to that? Like the sort of definition of what is this thing we are going to be talking about?
Well, I mean, so just in general, and as I define artificial intelligence, I just like to emphasize that it is not a thing, like a radio or a car, but rather it's a set of techniques that are aimed at approximating some aspect of human or animal cognition using machines. And what we're all currently very interested in is generative AI for its capacity to mimic human creativity. But it truly is just mimicking. Another example is deepfakes, which I hope we get a chance to talk about. They implicate other kinds of intellectual property rights, like your right to publicity, your right to your own likeness, or something like that, right? But again, it's just a technique, right? You're using typically GANs, generative adversarial networks, to produce this effect, essentially. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's talk about how these systems learn. And my understanding is that there are data sets put into these systems from which the system learns patterns, sort of, put on in a layman's terms. And in particular with AI and literature, these systems are learning based off of writing, be it articles, be it websites. Whole books have been put into this system, which is where we get into some problematic areas of copyright. So could we talk about where this information is coming from that these systems are learning from? Or to what extent we know? And I think this is part of the problem.
and I think this is the thing, that a lot of these things are proprietary, right? So we don't know for sure. We have a good guess. This is similar to guessing, Google's page rank. Technically, really, not most people don't know, right? I mean, very few people at Google knows what the real formula is. It's similar to the Coca-Cola formula. Very few people know, but we have a pretty good sense of what it contains, right? And that's why you see enough replications close enough to PageRank algorithm or close enough to Coca-Cola. So I think that's where we are with these large language models, that what OpenAI has done and what Microsoft has done, what Google has done, we don't know exactly, but we have pretty good understanding of what that may be. And so these data sets are typically, taken from the web. Wikipedia is one of the big sources, WebMD. So a lot of these kind of collections that contain tons and tons of text that go into that. And then there are many other kinds of language models that are coming up, and they're kind of getting trained on specific things. So for instance, you could create this kind of model on just say all the Shakespearean's work. And in fact, this is one of the things that Andrew Karpathy, who's a co-founder of OpenAI, he actually talks about, right? So you could actually take all the Shakespearean work, and that's all open source right now, right? So nobody owns a copyright for that. So you can take all that text and throw that into an LLM, and then you can have this model that can write in the style of Shakespeare, right? So it doesn't need to be the whole web. It doesn't need to be the whole Wikipedia. It could be something reasonable that's a large enough size of collection that starts giving a sense of what, as you were saying, Tara, like, getting those patterns. So it needs to be just large enough that there are enough patterns. So those who study Shakespeare can probably start saying, yeah, this, like if I see some text, this is written in that style, right? Similarly, other authors. How are we able to say that? Because we have seen enough pattern from that author. So yes, you could have an LLM pretty much on anything, including closed collections and small collections like that.
So, oh, sorry, please go ahead. Were you about to say something, Ryan? Oh, okay. So we've got these collections, and massive amounts of data are needed to, create these models. And some of it is open, some of it is not copyrighted, and some of it is. And this is really one of the seats of controversy. So let's just stick with the, sort of the generation part of it and talk a little bit about where these texts are coming from. And specifically from an author's standpoint, because this has become a hot button issue lately with authors who have found out that their books are either, well, as far as we can tell, right? And maybe someone can clarify this. There is a website out there where you can look up and see if your book has been used for OpenAI for populating those data sets. Now, how and perhaps this is a question for Sharma, within author communities, how is this being talked about? How are people receiving this? What is the general feeling out there among authors about this?
Yeah, well, the way that I found out that the Cassandra had been lifted for OpenAI was from a friend of mine who just happened to get on that database that you're talking about, which I think was published through the Atlantic Monthly. Mm-hmm. Does that sound right to people? If anybody's looking for it tonight. And she was on there. A whole host of our friends were on there, and then I was on there too. So I heard from her, and honestly, I was a little bit surprised because I'm sort of I think people would call me maybe a mid-list writer, but a lot of times I feel like I'm sort of low list, like not even quite to the mid-list yet. So I was a little bit surprised that I was on there. It did not surprise me, a friend, Jess Walter, was on there, like several of his books, I think 5 of his books. I was interviewed for the spokesman review about it, and Jamie Ford was interviewed, and a few of his books were taken as well. And I think for us, and I think I was even quoted in the spokesman review, I really felt like it was an egregious theft. I mean, these were works that were copyrighted. They're really seriously protected. They're protected as ebooks, as audiobooks, as print books. So for me, I'm still confused as to how this happened. It would be really interested to hear maybe Ryan's take on that and how this came to be. I started to hear from my agent about it. My agency, the agency she's with, Matthew McQuilkin, started contacting different writers with what they were learning from the Authors Guild and all of that as well. So it's been kind of an interesting process for me moving through this and my thoughts on this. I was kind of laughing with all of you before all of the other people arrived tonight about, I had a colleague who was always telling me that he was a techno optimist. He's so excited about ChatGPT and all it can do, and was having ChatGPT write all of his program descriptions at the library and everything. We're both on the programming team together. I really did feel more like a techno skeptic, which is the term I used. And I love what Chirag said about being a techno pragmatist. So I hope he tells the crowd that too. So yeah, but I'm also really interested to learn, because I meet with a lot of different writers at the Spokane Public Library, and I met with a writer the other day who's a poet who loves hybrid forms and experimental forms and is using ChatGPT in some surprising ways. And that was the first time I talked to a writer who was talking about using it for a creative advantage. I tend to, I'm sort of terrible about coming down hard on any one opinion. I kind of want to hear more and figure it out. So I feel like it is a very complex issue. But anyway, I am curious about how copyrighted work was taken for this. I am part of, I think with all the other thousands of writers, part of that class action lawsuit against OpenAI, and Microsoft has now been named there as well. And I'm not quite sure what's happening with all of that, but would love to hear some thoughts from people about how that came to be.
Yes, please enlighten us. And is it correct that this list that was given access to via the Atlantic, this isn't straight from ChatGPT? As I understand, it's kind of a recreation based on likely sources. Is that correct? Or if someone, one of our people who knows more, I'm hoping, I'm looking at you too. How did this happen? How did these copyrighted works wind up in the database? And is this information actually from ChatGPT, or was it this recreation of this potential database?
I confess I don't know. I mean, I assume that these so-called foundational models, these large language models that are initially trained and form the foundation of at least the text generative AI, they just gobble up whatever they can find, right? And so if something is on the internet, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure that they're paying close attention to what the source material might be. There is a protocol that is called robots.txt, and the purpose of which is to indicate that you don't want your website indexed, for example, for search purposes. And most search engines, Google, for example, will not index something with its crawlers, with its little robots that it sends out to pull everything in the internet, if it has that robots.txt in there. But I confess I literally do not know, and I'm not sure anybody outside of the companies really does know precisely what the guardrails are on some of these large language models. But Chirag may know that. Yeah.
Actually, Ryan, I was going to ask you something. So from what I understand, they're not really copying the stuff. What they're saying is our models are learning from this text, which is not the same as copying or storing it. And so, does that distinction make a difference here in terms of infringement?
It really doesn't. It really doesn't, because okay, so if you want to get into the law a little bit, that's where I feel most comfortable. Yes, and I'll just say briefly, that there's multiple concerns that people might have, some of which sound in copyright, others sound in other areas like of tort law, like appropriation of likeness, right? So one of the issues in copyright is the idea of, in order to train your model on this material, you do need to make an ephemeral copy of it. And And in most other instances in which copyright law has looked at, you know, digital copies, however ephemeral, even that transitory copying will be considered to be a copyright issue. The main question is whether training a model on copyrighted material constitutes fair use. Because there's an exception to copyright violations. It's not to say that you haven't, it's not to say that the material isn't copyrighted or you didn't copy it. It's to say that this copying is fair use. So for example, you know, if Sharma writes an essay about a poem and is trying to express to us what she feels is the sort of message of this poem or whatever, you know, she's able to copy from the poem, to just use lines from the poem, right? And it's not a copyright violation. She's literally copying from the poem, but she's doing so and it constitutes fair use because she's commenting upon the poem, and that's why she's doing the copying. So there's an ongoing debate about whether or not training these models on this data is fair use. And it certainly does not turn on whether or not it's copying. I think that's probably technically a non-starter. But then the other super interesting piece of this is, imagine that you have a bunch of source material that's not copyrighted, or is under like a Creative Commons license where you're being told that you can use it for certain kinds of purposes and that that's okay with the author. But then what you end up generating is in the style of that creator. You know what I mean? Just because you say you're free to remix my work and to use my work and whatever it happens to be, doesn't mean that you can produce things that look like my things, you know? So even if Sherlock Holmes winds up in the public domain, it doesn't mean that new Sherlock Holmes stories can be written without having to consult that estate, right? So, you know, it's well, you know, or it's a gray area, right? I mean, at the end of the day, like, you know, once something enters the public domain, it no longer is subject to copyright. But the authors in this instance are asserting copyright over work that is certainly not in the public domain, that they definitely have a copyright in.
Yeah, if I could just interject
please.
an anecdote. Jamie Ford talked about how he asked ChatGPT to write a short story in the form of Jamie Ford, and it did. It wrote, and he said it, you know, is it really his voice? It felt very wooden to him. It was not, you know, for him convincing, but it did have that intent. And I'm curious, but Chirag had emailed us about the word intent, intention. And I think that's a word I love to talk with students, writing students about when I'm teaching a class, always being aware of your intentionality. And I love kind of bringing that thought into it too, because yeah, that seems to really cross the line when you're watching ChatGPT try to mirror your style of writing back to you. So yeah. Intent.
Yeah, I'll add. So I think this is a key word for me, intent, and not just in this setting that we are talking about, but in general, when we talk about intelligence and we talk about, you know, there's a lot of conversation about artificial general intelligence. There's a lot of, you know, discussion about, you know, some of the systems are being sentient. They're starting to feel. They're starting to. Can they really do this, right? And I think it comes down to intent, and I'm sure intent has a meaning in legal domain too, which Ryan could talk about. But you know, like the example I was giving is, and just I was talking to somebody that a child who, you know, you take them to a store and they break something because they're being child. They didn't intentionally want to do this. They're just being themselves. They don't have any malicious intent. And everybody kind of understands that. But then somebody takes responsibility for it. Like, so the parent will say, oh, no, I'm so sorry, you know, this broke, let me fix it, pay for it, or whatever it is. And I think this is where kind of, you know, we are, that this AI is kind of this child, and maybe it's an orphan child and nobody wants to take responsibility, but can we really talk about like it having intent? Because all these things we talk about, like creativity, for instance, to me, creativity requires intent. Innovation requires, intent, responsibility requires intent. So it's hard for me to talk about or claim that any AI service system that I've seen actually has that intent. And so what's happening is we're just kind of projecting ourselves onto these systems, even when they're not really that, right? They're not really aware or intentional or any of the human characteristics that define us. But because we see them generating these tokens in a way that almost seems like somebody's talking to us, we see them kind of doing these things like producing text and images and stuff. We kind of start associating, projecting ourselves to them, and start kind of thinking about them as actual entity, as a living entity. But I think if we start asking, like, to be that, they need to have that intent. In the best case scenario, they're a child, and then somebody has to take responsibility for them. Worst case scenario, they're just copying things and parroting it out. So they're just a very sophisticated copying machine. How much credit do we want to give them?
Right. Yeah. And I think, the point you're making is the point I think we could generalize with all technology, is that, it really comes down to the intent of the people behind the technology, both in terms of the creators and the people who are using it. And one of the things that I have been trying to sort of, wrestle with in my mind as an author is, well, first of all, as a teacher, we abide by very strict guidelines in terms of how much we are allowed to copy in our classrooms, even for educational purposes, right? Not to make a profit, not to lure investors to our products, but for the simple goal of teaching, as Ryan was discussing. Second thing is, I think most writers have been given the task of try to write this in the voice of your favorite author. Or some authors will say copy work, copy sentences in longhand to try to sort of soak up the voice of one of their favorite authors. And then we take all of this reading we've been doing over the years and produce our own work. Maybe not, purposely in the voice of a specific author, but is there a parallel between what we're doing in a very slow manner by reading all of these authors and then producing our own work? And what makes that, less sinister than being able to do that with the stroke of a keyboard? So what are your thoughts on that, or what kind of conversations have you been having in terms of how people are using this, and how and why is this different?
Well, I mean, look, we can just talk about a number of different scenarios, okay? So if there's a system that is trained on all of Keanu Reeves' movies, and then it generates a pretend version of Keanu Reeves, we do not think that's okay, right? Similarly, if you're using Midjourney, which is a image generation engine, and you're telling it to create a Magic the Gathering card about elves that in the style of a famous Magic the Gathering artist, so that you do not have to pay that artist for the bunch of, you know what I mean, and that kind of thing, and you could just put, little, we don't think that's okay, right? But nobody thinks it's a serious issue that Microsoft uses our email in order to do autocomplete. And in an analog world, nobody seriously makes a huge fuss over the fact that, technically speaking, Amazon's, empire is built on public roads. You know what I mean? And so it's a line drawing exercise, and the truth of the matter is that when you're trying to seek recourse, you have to go and look at the statute or the common law cause of action and see whether the elements are met, right? Because that's the funny thing about the law. There's all kinds of things that we might think are unfair, gross, or whatever, that are not actionable because we live in a system of negative liberties and no one's passed a law against it, or no court has recognized a common law cause of action. So I don't know. I mean, it does feel wrong to me personally when a system generates a credible version of a particular style or image or voice that could readily substitute for that individual, right? Or where the audience conflates the work with the individual, and yet my own intuitions are not. I'm not concerned about original work being created based on all the words on the internet. You see what I mean? And so it's not an easy line to draw. I will say that sometimes we do overstate the capacity of these systems. Like, one of my favorite examples of this. So, Tara, speaking of Hugo House, so I do a year long in poetry with Bill Carty. And Bill pointed out about ChatGPT that it cannot, at least the version we were using, 3.5, it cannot write a poem that doesn't rhyme. And so I literally told ChatGPT, and I said, write a poem about oranges, famously with no, that doesn't rhyme. And it wrote a rhyming poem, the theme of which was how oranges don't rhyme. You know what I mean? And so it's like, you have to remember, it's not going to actually be, you know what I mean? And so our friends who are artists, I mean, it's not an amazing poet or an amazing novelist who is presently too concerned, right, about it. But it's where it's going, and it's certain instantiations that feel wrong and problematic.
Well, and it's not for lack of trying. I mean, within the speculative fiction community, Clark's World is famously battling with the huge influx of AI generated short stories, because they're always open for submissions and they're always findable and they pay well. So, people, we may be laughing now, but people are trying it, But yeah, Chirag.
Yes, I think we are really at that intersection where so much of this is new that we don't know the social acceptability of it and the real capability of it, right? But there have been enough instances so far that make us kind of alarm about this. Was it Sports Illustrated that had to pull out a lot of their content because it was generated by AI? And that's something that worries me, because this is a reputable publication that has done this or started doing this, right? And currently the model that we have is, well, there are certain places that I would trust, the sources, the journalistic sources, because they do their due diligence. They're not relying on a shortcut. But now if they start using this, that kind of worries me. And I think, again, I'm hoping that we don't cross that barrier, but there have been other instances on Amazon. I think it was author, publisher Jane
Friedman.
Yeah. I think, a bunch of things showed up with her name, and fortunately Amazon even took it back. But and maybe nobody got harmed, but there are all these books about mushrooms that are auto-generated and that are showing up on Amazon. And if you know mushrooms, some of them are actually bad. And if an expert doesn't show you how to pick mushrooms and which ones are actually to avoid, there could be real harms, right? And so I think we're starting to kind of toy around with this line where the real harms start happening. And in some of these cases, or most of these cases, we've been able to backtrack So that's kind of good. But it's a question of like, when do we cross that line and go so far that there's no coming back from it? And when do these things become so effective? Like right now, as Ryan was saying, well, and I agree that there's a limit to their capabilities, right? But it's just a matter of time. It seems like we're almost there. In some of the cases, we're starting to push through that boundary. So I think that's where the concern is, not so much like what they're able to do right now, but I think everybody sees like what could be. And we're not talking about 10 years from now or 5 years from now, right? So I mean, before we started this, I was talking about how, and Sharma, you mentioned, I'm an AI pragmatist, which means I look at things how they are, instead of like creating the hypes and horrors. So I'm not concerned about Terminators coming, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. But I do see these models getting better and better, more and more sophisticated, where some of these boundaries are breached and often not realized until it's too late. The other thing I can see happening is, and this is up in the air at this point, like our social acceptability. Would we be okay reading a novel written by an AI if it still gives us that reading pleasure, if it still gives us, it still gets us that goosebumps when reading thriller, edge of your seat, if it still generates those emotions in us, you could start arguing, well, so then who cares if it was written by a real person or not? And I think we're not there yet, but I know, but this is where it gets like, will we have that social acceptability? Would the reader start accepting that, right? And that would be crossing the line. That's where, and so before the Terminators can happen, this has potential of happening.
Yeah, Sharma, what do you say to that?
I just want to see what the ratings of those books will be on. Are they going to be
willing to take the chance?
The rest of us, like, how many 1-star reviews are they going to get? What do I think of that? I mean, immediately I feel my heart hurt. I mean, I think this is where it starts to get very emotional for me. I'd be curious to hear what you think too as an author, Tara, because I know how how personal my writing is to me. I mean, personal in the sense that even when I'm writing really fantastical, really strange fiction, I am plumbing the recesses of my memories, my experiences, a lot of them, some of my, most traumatic experiences, and putting them on the page. And I also think my imagination is personal to me. It's something extraordinary. It's something extraordinary I find about human beings. Our storytelling in general, I find extraordinary. And it's something that I want people to hold on to as precious and dear. I work in the public library, and I really feel like the whole backbone of libraries are the human story. And sometimes when I hear, that administration or a colleague is using AI to write things for the library, even, I think, wow, it seems like we're taking a step back from the human story if we're doing this. And then also, because my imagination is weird, I start thinking of robots I've loved in literature, like Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. And I'm like, maybe I'm not being kind enough to the robots, maybe they will become sentient. I don't know. So my mind's all over the place with this stuff. But I do just feel like, I want to hold storytelling, hold the human story really dear. And I worry about it being homogenized somehow through this all, when I think what we've needed, what I hope keeps happening is there's an expansion of what stories are being told, and all of that too. So I would love to hear what you think too, Tara, about all of that.
Yeah, well, I was one of the lucky ones who did not find my name on that list. But, writer friends of mine who did, of course, just felt violated, right? Because, I mean, we're supposed to have, all rights reserved, right? In all of our contracts, all rights not specifically given to another party are reserved by us. And so there's that feeling that, you know, this thing happened without your knowledge and is being used to sort of create this thing that, you know, could eventually replace you. I think there's certainly going to be a subset of readers who don't really care if they are enjoying the novel or the story or what have you. They're just going to enjoy it. And an author friend of mine was at was listening to a different presentation by an agent who was saying, well, the presentation was about how to inject more of the topical and popular things and trends and how to get more of that into your manuscript so you could sell it. And I feel like that's just putting us on this path to, you know, story as product. And yes, we know it is. We know agents and publishers need to sell in order to live. But, you know, this is just going to create a structure to kind of, you know, call these things up on demand. And there are readers out there who aren't really going to be bothered. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly a topic of a nerve-wracking thought. Ryan, I see your hand up there.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, like one of the things that is important to remember is that these systems all behave somewhat differently. Okay, and if you look at AlphaZero, which is DeepMind's chess playing system, okay, it does not work like ChatGPT. It is not generating new moves based on previous moves, right? The innovation of AlphaZero and the reason that it's so incredibly powerful as a chess engine is that the system played itself over and over and over and over and over again using reinforcement learning, where it would get additional rewards for, you know, taking pieces and ultimately winning the game. Okay. And what was fascinating was that AlphaZero began to play chess like no human had ever played chess before. And now human chess players emulate AlphaZero. Okay. That is not what we would expect with these large language models or this generative AI. They are confined to what's come before, right? We're not going to get a Dadaist movement, you know, from what is happening. It's not going to create something that humans haven't done before. And, you know, that's really unfortunate, right? So if more and more of our text and art and literature is generated by machines that are trained on previous human inputs, it is not clear how we would go on to innovate. Now, it is not inevitable because, of course, these systems are capable of emergent behavior. But when I say these systems, I mean artificial intelligence in general. I don't mean these specific deep learning systems, right? So, you know, that's what I really, really worry about, is that even if they got good enough that readers were like, yeah, sure, I'd like a mystery by like ChatGPT 9. You know what I mean? Like, this is a new mystery by ChatGPT 9 at the airport. You know, the problem is that someone came up with the genre of mystery. Do you know what I mean? Like, just we're just never going to break another mold.
But so Ryan, I mean, I can see that being okay for a lot of cases. I don't know, let's put some number, 80% of the cases where, you know, you're picking up that book not because you're really expecting something completely different that nobody has ever done before, but because you actually want that familiar thing. You know, I mean, so many authors that I read, I pick them up because I like their style and I want to see the next one. You know, it's like that's kind of nice comfort, right? And so I think I can imagine there being cases like 20% of the cases or 10% of cases where you do want to see completely something different. And so again, my question goes back to like, when would we be okay with that? To accept that, yeah, this is yet another novel by version 9. So what, right? But that's what I'm looking for, and that's okay with me, versus like yet another novel by this my favorite author. it's the same thing, right? So maybe there will, and again, personally to me that's worrisome, right? I mean, I wouldn't want us to get there, but I can see a more plausible path to being there, where for a lot of people that's okay. In preparation for this panel, I was actually also asking my friends in both in academia and industry about like how they feel about this, and one of the things that they kept saying is like, well, I don't know, something about like AI writing novel that even if I like, I'm not comfortable with it, but I can't put my finger on like why would it be uncomfortable. And after a lot of discussions, like what I came to understand, and Sharma and Tara, you can correct me if this resonates with you, is as a reader, when we read something, it's not just about content, but it's also about the entity behind that content, who generated it. So even if it's fiction, even if it's not a nonfiction, you kind of understand that the author has put in this like some of their own experiences through that, right? So for instance, like I enjoy mystery novels. And so when I'm reading this novel, chasing, all these places in Europe, I kind of envision author going to these places, researching those places, talking to a lot of people, and synthesizing all of that into this. And so part of my enjoyment is also that appreciation for what author has gone through. And then a lot of things I read is nonfiction, in which case it is really their life story. It is really their own pain and experiences that they're expressing. And so it's not just the content, right? But that connection, and when people say, well, I don't know, I don't like, what the AI stuff, it's not so much of the content, but realizing that it's kind of fraud, right? So every now and then we find some author who made some stuff up, or journalists, and we were in love with their content before, but suddenly we changed our minds because we saw that disconnect, right? So I think there's more than just the content. It's also that connection to the author. And that's our unease right now with AI generated stuff. Would we ever get to like be okay with it? I can see it happening.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things you've touched on that really strike me as being relevant to this conversation. I think for me, a lot of when I read and when I really connect with a book, I'm thinking about what it means to be human. I think the best literature is exploring that. Can AI write a book that speaks to us? That would make a great plot to a novel, maybe, if someone wants to take that on. Are they capable of writing something that captures the human story? But I also think that I learned very quickly working in bookstores and libraries that the general public does not read what I read. Typically, like literary fiction is not, probably for good reason, for all I know, not the most popular genre. Formulaic fiction is some of the best-selling, most published books out there. Mysteries, cozy mysteries, regular mysteries, crime novels, all of that. Those are huge sellers, the Jane Pattersons of the world and all of that. And I think those really are going to be quite at risk potentially with something that can emulate those formulas, as everybody's been discussing here. I guess right now, I think it would be snotty of me to think that those books are not about the human story, because I think they are. I think storytelling has felt incredibly human from its inception. So I'm interested to see how the notion of storytelling is changing with somebody coming in, having designed these programs that can then emulate storytelling at its very heart. What does that do for us? I think in a lot of ways, we're sort of canceling ourselves in this world. We're canceling a lot in this world. And this may be just another way that we're speeding up our imminent doom. Fearful way to put it. Said with a smile.
I'll tell you, actually, one of my PhD students is working on a project to see if ChatGPT generated reviews on a research paper are comparable or better than a human generated reviews. And so eventually, if she's successful, she'll be able to replace me as an advisor because she could just, so yes, we are canceling ourselves.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness.
Worrisome.
Sorry, go
Worrisome.
ahead. Oh, yeah. Well, this is actually a great segue to one of the questions in the Q&A, and I do want to make sure we make time for those. But I think it also gets into the discussion we're sort of sneaking into, which is the purpose of the communication. Is it an article? Is it some sort of rote, sports recap, which has been going on for a while with AI generating those? Is it a summary, or is it, meaning to be art? And is that even possible? So let's continue on this question of intent and purpose. This question is from the audience. Do you believe that the increasing reliance on AI for communication might lead to a stagnation in the evolution and style of our language/communication, resulting in a more monotonous and less dynamic linguistic landscape? Or is this concern simply an overstatement? If we're using, in other words, if we're using this not just for sort of rote communication, but also for storytelling, what is that going to do to our language in the long run?
It's going to deeply impoverish it. And let me give you an example. For a period of time, it was natural language processing relied upon a select number of corpus of enormous amounts of words. And one of the places that you could find the most natural language to train your model on was the Enron emails. Because of the Enron litigation and the fact that all of those emails came out in discovery. And so there was this gigantic public corpus of emails, communication between people, right? And if you train a model on the Enron emails and then you ask it to come up with new emails, you know what I mean? Like, think about what those sound like, right? And think about what they don't sound like. But then extrapolate to all human, not all language, by the way, because I have had, of course, students and faculty point out very recently, I was at an event at University of Pennsylvania where a Korean PhD candidate pointed this out. It doesn't work very well with Korean. So we're talking about English. Do you know what I mean? And so like, we're talking about a language, like a particular language. And we're talking about all that's been said before. And, and as a matter of fact, many of these instantiations have a cutoff date where they say, I can't answer questions after 2015 because that's when the end of my training is, right? And therefore, I don't use idioms and I don't use associations and I don't use analogies that are from any or later than that, right? I think it's pretty obvious technically that if our previous language is the basis of our future language, that we do not see the kind of living communication that you would otherwise. I think that's clear to me.
Would anyone else like to respond to that? Or does he speak for us all in fearing for the future of communication?
It just can't, I mean, it just can't, right? Again, it's like Soylent Green AI, right? It's made out of people, it's people. And so it's what people have said in the past, which is why we're worried about it being biased, because it's trained on a bunch of biased people, right? And the idea that it's going to be debiased is ludicrous because it is ultimately trained, if you were to fast forward to two futures, one future wherein human beings continue to speak as we do, and we shed our biases, or we were less biased, or we learned from our mistakes over time, and then later on, you used to look at the state of communication, it would look one way. But if you just were to generate all the language into the future from the current language, it would never shed that bias. Do you see what I mean? Like, again, it feels philosophically, like, analytically obvious and deeply concerning to me. That's like deeply concerning.
Well, there was a question about bias in the chat as well. So you are not the only one who's concerned about that particular point. There's a lot of concerns in the Q&A. So what might we do to combat this bias and sort of impoverishment of the language? If on the one hand we want to restrict the usage so as to protect international or to protect intellectual property and people's copyright rights. But on the other hand, we also see this as an inevitability that it's going to be ever more used. How do we manage this so that we aren't training ourselves into this impoverished and biased language? How do we go about this? I want answers.
Well, we have tried answering it, right? And a lot of other people have. So bias is something that, my lab has done a lot of work, but it's been a very prominent issue in this space for a long time. There's no easy answer here. There's no straightforward answer here. Part of the problem is also that we are all biased, right? So, I mean, we would like to just kind of point fingers at some machine and but the fact is, all these things that the machine started looking at, whether from the past to the current, is coming from humans as of now. Maybe there will come a time when machines are learning from machine-generated language, but right now it's mostly human-generated stuff, and that is actually pretty biased, right? And so we have this big issue where, forget about this generative AI thing, but all of our machine learning models have this problem that they're trained on data that is human-generated, and human-generated thing, they are biased in different ways. So as long as we keep using the past to predict the future, we're going to be the victim of this mechanism, which is we just can't avoid. And so the only way really is we have to be proactive about this. So there's a value in using the past. Of course, we do this all the time, whether it's a stock market or elections or whatever, we always look at the past. But then there has to be some way to also add some correction to that. So we don't keep extrapolating the same way that we have done that. And then in some of the cases, we have been actually able to do that, right? And some of the countries, cultures, and domains, there have been this active efforts to nullify some of the past behaviors to chart a better future, but we haven't been able to do this in a broad sense, right? And maybe Ryan can speak more to that. Would regulation help here? Would some kind of structure, whether it's legal or social structure, can help here? But it's a complex issue, and my best hope here is we do this in piecemeal, at least in some closed domain, where we can say, well, healthcare, let's tackle that so that the past biases we don't carry out in the healthcare for this. So let's at least do that. Maybe we're not able to do that in sports, or not able to do that in other domains, but let's do in this particular domain. So I think that's where some of the help is, but some of the hope is. But I think it's a very complex issue, and it starts with us, unfortunately. As much as I would like to point fingers to others, yeah, we're all part of the problem, and we all have to be part of the solution. That's why.
The Authors Guild is putting forward a proposal to recognize and compensate authors whose works have been sort of hoovered up into this corpus. And that might be a way forward, right? In fact, they're saying, okay, we can't sort of unwind what's already been done. We can ask that our authors be compensated for this, and that going forward, we come up with some sort of remuneration that people can opt in or opt out, however that will work, whereby this becomes a practice and not just sort of like a random scraping.
So who's paying for this? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah, so their idea is that if a technology company is using this information, the technology company should be paying for the
Yeah.
information.
And are they?
Not yet. That's why they're in court.
See, this is
Yeah.
My check for 14 cents. I know it's tough. Gonna be one of the thousands of writers who gets a 14-cent check. So.
But this is we've seen this similar things, right? I mean, I often complain about it that all the work that we are doing for debiasing stuff, right? It's created by the systems that are for profit, right?
Mhm.
So somebody who's making profit of it build the systems that now everybody's using that has bias, and now we're doing all this work to unbias these things. Or somebody build this model, machine learning model that's black box complex, and now we're creating things to like make it explainable, right? This is similar to the opioid crisis where somebody profited out of it, and now the healthcare system gets stuck with like curing the patients and you're doing things. So I think there's a fundamental problem here in our society, like who's creating problems and who's paying for it. Sorry for going on this rant, but had to be said.
No, actually, one of the comments in the Q&A was like, y'all seem to be very sanguine about this. What about the urgency? So yes, we are getting into that. Let's see. A couple of questions in here are referencing whether or not AI could create a new literary movement. One of the commenters was curious about the author that Sharma was talking about earlier, who was using AI as part of their creative process. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit more insight into that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what exactly they meant by that. This is a writer I just met at one of the libraries. He recently moved here from Seattle, and he was telling me kind of some of his interests. And that was one of them, using ChatGPT to create poems, stories, but in a way that was, and we're bringing that word back in, very intentional, and that had his input. And I'm not sure if it's combining Chat GPT with his own writing. I'm not quite sure, but sounds like he is a published poet. I don't have his permission to share his name here, so I won't be doing that. But yeah, I was kind of stunned when I heard that. And also, I'm kind of wowed by how artists can almost take anything and create something interesting with it. And I think even doing that could, in its own way, critique what ChatGPT does, because it would be potentially playing around with it in a way that might subvert what it is meant for, and that might be really interesting. So I have no doubt. I mean, and this is when we're talking about biases, and I start thinking about larger world biases too, and I feel like I feel this way about intimate violence within our families, and I feel this way with like global wrongdoings and everything. I feel like it's the human storytelling that happens, the music, the art, the writing, all of that, that is, if not an antidote for anything, because I feel like things stay miserable and miserable things keep happening for all eternity. I'm kind of a sad person in that way with that belief, but I do think our ability to storytell and to listen to one another's stories is, if not a panacea for that, it is a commentary on all of that, and it can bring about something healthier. So my hope is that we won't allow these technologies to strip us of our artistic abilities and our abilities to tell stories, because I think that's how we move forward in a healthier way in a society. And if we're quieting voices, if we're silencing voices, people are already quiet, they've already been silenced. We need to be doing the opposite and not taking away more voices, and giving them to AI systems and such. Tangent there, but yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually related to a question, one of the questions I wanted to bring up. The revelation of AlphaGo and AlphaZero is exactly that humans started playing differently after encountering these systems, as referring to Ryan's earlier comment. Why wouldn't a generation who grew up reading AI generated text be influenced by those kinds of texts, both the ways that it's the same as human text and the ways that it's different? And kind of relating to Sharma's comment about, why can't we use this to stretch our practices? The way I see artists already doing with Midjourney, and they're creating these amazing works that just, that are bending my mind, and that we might not have come up with had we not had this kind of like altered sort of uncanny valley mirror to ourselves. And I think that is what we're not going to go backwards. We can't, as much as we might like to, but as Sharma was saying, it's up to us to sort of take charge of the process and to keep to keep creating in the way that only we know how. We are not, as Ryan was saying, unlike AI systems, we're not sort of held captive to what was done before. And I think it's incumbent upon us to take charge of these materials and use them as artists use them, and with the responsibility of identifying what we're using, right? Just like, visual artists will say, this is oil on canvas, or this is collage, list your materials. We may come to a point when we have to do that as part of our practice. And I feel like that's a way to sort of be honest with our viewers and our readers, to let them know what they're ingesting, just like, the list of ingredients on foods. Like I think we're going to have to be more transparent about what we're creating and how we're creating it. I saw Chirag's mic go on, and then Ryan's.
Ryan can go first. Yeah, on this.
Well, look, I mean, my mom was just in town, and she's a retired art historian. The truth of the matter is that there has been appropriation of cultural materials, reconfiguration of cultural materials for many, many, many years. We think of Warhol's Campbell's Soup, but even more recently, Damien Hirst at the Biennale, where he made a fake universe where we discovered ancient artifacts underneath the ocean floor, and one of them looked an awful lot like the Disney Mickey Mouse. Do you know what I mean? And so for me, the most interesting artistic stuff takes the artifacts of artificial intelligence and kind of plays with it. So a couple of examples. One is, there's this whole thing on the internet about a person who keeps claiming that they fed an AI system thousands of Quentin Tarantino scripts, and then they forced it to generate a new one, and then they write a new one, which obviously it's not machine learning doing it, it's this person, but they're emulating what it sounds like if machine learning were to pump out Quentin Tarantino, as a commentary on both machine learning and Quentin Tarantino, right? And another example, I mean, there's sort of myriad examples. Another one is that there was a whole thing going around where they pretended to interact with Midjourney or DALL-E to make the more and more extreme versions of something. So my favorite is like this thing where with a bunch of people from McKinsey, the consulting firm, trying to maximize profits. And then there's a series of fake prompts where they say more, even more, you don't understand, it's got to be so much. And it just becomes absurd, more and more and more absurd, until the McKinsey people are screaming, and everything is full of charts and everything else. And it's not really from Midjourney. It's a person who made this as digital art, making fun of both McKinsey's profit motivation and the way it works. Like, that shit is, excuse me, that is art, right? That is art. But the stuff that this stuff produces You know what I mean? Like, come on. You know what I mean? It's not. And so people are ingenious, and people will use cultural and social and artistic materials and consistently reconfigure. But the most interesting stuff happening today is people commenting on AI and not what AI is generating. And that is distinctly different from how AlphaGo has changed the way people play Go, an ancient game, or changed the way people have played chess. You know what I mean? I mean, that is a really different enterprise, and it has very little to do with what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
I will add, and this is me being, pragmatist here, where we looked at this problem of bias in images, and one of the things we found is a typical machine learning system has a hard time identifying, classifying women of color who are doctors, because there are just not that many examples. There are many examples of women of color who are nurses, right? And so one of the problems we've had is, like, the systems are trained on this biased data set because that's the real world, that's a reality, right? I mean, most Fortune 500 CEOs are white male. That's a reality, but the systems are learning from that. And when you ask them to predict what a CEO looks like or what a doctor looks like, they're relying on their bias, idea of, these things. So we wanted to change that. And to do that, and this is ironic, that we use generative AI to address this. And the way we, did that, without going into the technical stuff, is essentially you could have DALL-E or Midjourney generate these kind of images that don't exist. So we don't have enough real world data of non-white male CEOs or women of color who are doctors, but we could create those and feed it back to the machine, saying that, look, women of color could be doctors, a person of color could be a CEO, and so on. So I think there's a way to use these things for what it's worth. And that, to me, that's the pragmatic approach, right? And actually all this, if you think about any of the sci-fi things, where machines are turned against humans, well, humans are fighting with them using machines, right? And so that there's your irony that, and it becomes the question of who's holding, like, who's right here, like, is this really the machines, is this really the humans using machines against machines using humans against humans, all of those things. I think, fortunately, we're not there yet, but I think there are still already potential. Another example I'll give is there was a system, I think it was from Microsoft, way before the LLMs and everything, for writer unblocking, which is, we all experience writer's block, and you could use some help from system. Let's not even call it AI, right? But something where somebody just gives you, or something just gives you some fodder that can help you. So there was a system that actually, essentially, you're sitting in front of your Word with a blinking cursor, and you can't figure out what to, and you can evoke this, and it will start generating some ideas. It will start giving you something. Maybe 80% of that is whatever, but some of that 20% will spark that. Okay, let me now go on. So it's still your creativity, it's still your writing, but you just needed that boost. So I don't see a problem in using something like that. And maybe, Sharma, this is what you're kind of referring to before. So I can see real uses of these technology in more than just writing or finishing the novel.
And I wish we did have time to keep delving into this, because, there's all that, like, where's the line between inspiration and then, doing the actual work. But we are closing in on our end time. So I would just like to, if I could go around and ask each one of you to briefly sum up in, a couple of sentences, like, sum up this debate. Where do you fall? Where do you end after all of this discussion? I'll go ahead and start to give you time to sort of think about what you'd like to close out on. And I think it's really figuring out where those lines are between what is ours and what are we ceding to some other system. And so our responsibility as human beings is to keep injecting ourselves on both the front end, as Sharma said, as Chirag said, in terms of like feeding a better past to the computers so that we could maybe imagine a better future, and at the output stage to make sure that we are, maintaining our own voice in these creative projects. So that's where I end my comments. Who would like to give their? I see Chirag. I see your mic open. So would you like to?
I never closed my mic. So
oh, you didn't? Okay. All right.
But
I thought you were like
Ryan
yeah,
or Sharma go, I guess.
Well, yeah, it's hard for me to summarize what I'm thinking right now. I mean, I'm thinking about the idea of seeming sort of sanguine about all of this. And I think, in a certain way, I feel like maybe that's a little bit of a helpless feeling. I would love to believe that writers will be safe from these technologies moving forward, and I'm not sure I trust that that's going to happen. And I think maybe I feel that way for a lot of different reasons right now. I feel like there's always a risk of stories being shuttered somehow. And this is one of the new challenging ways that might happen. So I just hope, I'm hoping that people out there will protect their writers, protect their artists, and stay aware of this, keep discussing it. I know we're right at the very start of it. That almost freaks me out because we're going to see technology develop. What's going to come next? I'll be really curious to see what happens with the Authors Guild decision. And I just want to say I really appreciate everybody on this panel, and getting to learn from all of you has been really great too. So yes, sanguine / helpless.
Thank you.
I think, I often think about, this Turing test, which is, Alan Turing proposes to see if a system has become intelligent enough, and that test has been found irrelevant for quite some time, even before all this new thing, because it's easy to cheat, it's easy to mimic. And I think Ryan was saying, like, these systems are basically just mimicking. So if they're really good at mimicking, they can pass the Turing test. And then that's just one of the reasons why the test is not very useful. But the test does give us some idea about, like, some thoughts. So for instance, back then it was, thought to be like, if a system, if you can have a natural language conversation with a system without realizing that it is not a human, then it passed the test, which means that, the main characteristic of a human, being a human, is having that natural language understanding and processing. But now we can start questions like, oh, wait, no, that's not enough. To be a human, you have to be also able to do, maybe you have to be able to feel, like real empathy. To be a human, you have to be able to think and socialize, and like you can start listing the things, right? And then you can say, well, only then, if somebody can do that, then not only they've achieved the AGI, but only then they're humans. And I think this is, to me, is the most valuable part of this, out of it, which makes us think about, like, what does it mean to be human, right? So Sharma, going back to what you're saying, that we write stories not just to entertain and inform, but to actually communicate with one another, to be humans with one another, right? So this is our way of connecting with one another. And if that's an important thing, if that's a requirement, then that's something that AI will never achieve. Just by definition, it's just not, or maybe, it's going to be a long way before it can happen. So I think it's time that we start asking this fundamental question about, like, before we think about artificial intelligence, what is the natural intelligence? What does it mean to be human? And to be able to appreciate art, to be able to connect with the author behind the content, And so I think we haven't asked enough of these questions. And that's why we are struggling with some of the answers, because it's, we're standing on a shaky ground where we can't even define ourselves so well. And we're trying to define this artificial entity, like some aliens who suddenly came to our planet and now inhabiting this planet, and we're trying to figure out how to work with them. But we haven't figured out our own stuff among ourselves. So it's an interesting time, but I hope the good thing out of this is it finally allows us to focus on us. What makes us us? So that's where I'll leave you.
Thank you.
And there's a lot of things that I could say. I'm just going to leave you with this, okay? Be careful extrapolating out from the recent advances, right? I was born, I was this big, okay? By the time I was 18, I was 6'2". All right, I'm still 6'2". If you were to extrapolate out based on that pattern of my growth, I would be 12, 14 feet tall, right? It is possible that this stuff got to a point, and it's just about as good as it's going to get it sometime soon. And in which case, none of this sea change that we're talking about will really happen. So let's see, But I will say that it would be a sad society that the way that we made progress was not by getting less racist and sexist, but like by turning things over to machines and then giving them better examples. Like, come on. Anyway, this has been really enjoyable. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh my gosh. Thank you all so much for this fantastic hour and a half together. I am so grateful. I'm going to include in the chat a brief evaluation of this that we would love for all of you at home to take. And while you're pulling that up, I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, Tara Campbell. Incredible job moderating this incredible discussion. Sharma Shields, thank you so much for the conversation about what it means to be human and your very emotional response. I really resonated with that. Ryan, thank you so much as always for your expertise on the legal side and all of your very approachable metaphors. I always appreciate it. Soylent Green coming up with AI, love to see it. Chirag, thank you again, as always, for your incredibly approachable, human, and really, really clear, accessible explanations of what AI is and what it can do. This has really just been such a joy to hear from all four of you. And as I've, gotten texts and seen in the chat, the opportunity to hear from both authors and AI experts has been really wonderful. So I want to thank you all again. Thank you all at home for attending one of our final events of 2023 for Humanities Washington. We have a full slate coming up in 2024. If you yourself are a writer or interested in being a writer, you can take one of Tara Campbell's speculative fiction workshops that she'll be offering as part of our Speakers Bureau in 2024. So keep an eye out for future novels, future papers, appearances from all four of these folks. Again, thank you for joining the free event. If you're able to consider a donation to Humanities Washington as part of our year-end campaign, we would greatly appreciate it to keep these events coming. So with that, thank you all so much. We're going to wrap up with the webinar. It always ends kind of abruptly. So I will say again, thank you. Have a wonderful night. Thank you all four of you. Thank you everyone at home. Have a good night.